As never before, we are confronted with the unthinkable specter of a nuclear Armageddon.
By the time Coretta Scott King delivered this speech at the Cathedral of St. John in New York City, she'd been an anti-nuclear advocate for nearly 30 years. Coretta was an activist and leader. She stood for peace in a world of violence.
Did you educate Mrs. King to become equal to you in terms of sharing this burden, or did you research her before your marriage to see that she had the potential for this, or how did it come about?
Well, it may have been the other way. I think at many points she educated me.
Her activism began in college, where she supported the NAACP and other peace and race-related causes.
Because she was as actively involved and concerned when we met as she is now.
She was ahead of Martin on the peace issue. For instance, she was the first to criticize the war in Vietnam.
I call upon the President of the United States to stop the bombing in Vietnam now.
And as her anti-war efforts escalated, so did her anti-nuclear activities. In 1957, Coretta was present for the creation of SANE, the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy. Martin Luther King Jr. followed her lead, publicly supporting SANE 4 years later in 1961.
I refuse to accept the cynical notion that nation after nation must spiral down a militaristic stairway into the hell of nuclear annihilation.
And throughout the 1960s, Coretta Scott King was an early integral member of Women's Strike for Peace, an anti-nuclear organization. The press failed to see that it was Coretta who was the clear leader when it came to peace and nuclear disarmament.
Incidentally, in terms of the peace demonstration in Washington, I noticed that your wife was there, but you were not. A copy of of her address. Mm-hmm. And I wondered, as I read through it, whether you had any hand in the writing of it, or whether this stemmed from her, essentially.
No, I didn't have a hand in the writing of it. This stemmed from her.
Despite all of this, Coretta Scott King pushed forward on peace and civil rights, which she saw as linked.
Sometimes I fear that I have devoted my entire attention to comforting 4 small children and supporting my husband in his activities in the civil rights struggle to the neglect of the peace cause. However, I must remind myself that peace and justice or freedom are indivisible.
After her husband's assassination, Coretta Scott King continued fighting for these issues.
In Washington, Mrs. Martin Luther King led 45,000 candlelight marchers from the Washington Monument to the White House.
And worked tirelessly toward a better future.
You can't fight poverty and discrimination. You can't provide health security and decent housing. And you can't have a clean environment in the lengthening shadow of nuclear arsenals.
Coretta Scott King was a fearless activist working against misogyny, violence, and racism. Yet, she saw a peaceful world and maintained her vision of an Earth without nuclear weapons, without fear.
If our world is to be saved from nuclear annihilation, it will be people like you and me who are willing to work hard enough to bring about the changes which will lead to peace on earth, goodwill toward men.